Ready for a deep dive into something a little different? We're tackling zombies this time.
But this isn't your typical zombie flick.
Definitely not. We're dissecting two really interesting sources, World War Z and the Zombie Survival Guide, both by Max Brooks.
And both about surviving a zombie apocalypse, but in very different ways.
Exactly. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? Zombies. But trust me on this, it gets really interesting because it's about way more than just brain-eating monsters.
Right, it's about us.
Exactly.
How we react when things go sideways.
It's about human nature, the good, the bad, and the just plain strange. So where do we even start with something like this?
Well, Brooks himself says in World War Z that to survive the future, you have to understand the past. He believes that looking back, learning from history, that's key to navigating any crisis.
And he's got a point, right? Even if that crisis involves, well, fictional zombies.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea. First up, the Zombie Survival Guide. It's like the ultimate how-to manual for surviving a full-blown zombie outbreak.
Which, as you might imagine, involves a lot more than just holding up with a shotgun and a year's supply of baked beans.
Way more. Brooks gets into the nitty-gritty of mental and physical preparedness. Like, how do you even wrap your head around the fact that the world has gone undead?
It's about adapting old survival strategies to a whole new enemy. Think about historical sieges, for example. Knowing the terrain, securing resources, maintaining morale, those were critical then, and they'd be just as crucial in a zombie apocalypse. So we're talking about a different kind of warfare, right? And that's where Brooks throws some curveballs. He challenges those classic zombie movie tropes we all think we know. Like, remember those iconic scenes of survivors blasting away with shotguns?
Yeah, Brooks actually argues that might not be the best tactic.
Oh, really? Why not? Shotguns seem pretty effective in the movies.
It's about efficiency. Brooks points out that a well-placed rifle shot to the head is far more effective than a shotgun blast.
So it's about precision over power in this case.
Exactly. It's about understanding the difference between spread and penetration. You want to take down the zombie, not just slow it down.
Makes sense. So what about something a little more, shall we say, medieval? Brooks talks about armor, right? Like full-on knight's armor.
He does. And it's not as crazy as it sounds. Brooks argues that medieval armor could provide surprisingly good protection against zombie bites.
Really? I mean, imagine trying to outrun a horde in a full suit of armor. Talk about a workout.
Well, there are trade-offs, of course. Brooks acknowledges the downsides, limited mobility, the noise factor. It's not exactly stealthy.
Yeah, you'd basically be ringing a dinner bell for the undead. Speaking of attracting zombies, Brooks debunks another classic movie trope, the mad dash to the supermarket for supplies.
Right. Seems logical at first. Stock up on food, right?
Yeah, isn't that the first thing everyone does in zombie movies?
It is, but Brooks wants us to think like a zombie. Where would they congregate? Where's the densest source of food?
A supermarket full of terrified people.
Bingo. He says that a crowded supermarket would be a death trap, a feeding frenzy waiting to happen.
Wow. So much for that shopping spree. It's these practical, but kind of unexpected tips that make the Zombie Survival Guide so interesting.
It's about challenging those assumptions we've all picked up from movies and books. Brooks forces you to think differently, to really strategize about how to survive.
He even throws in these little anecdotes, stories of people who tried to survive the outbreak. Like, remember that one about the guy who barricaded himself inside his own house?
Oh yeah, with all the supplies he could ever need, but no way to get out.
The ultimate safe but sorry situation. Brilliant for safety, maybe not so much for sanity in the long run, but it does make you think, doesn't it? Like, even with the best preparations, things can still go terribly wrong.
And to understand just how wrong things can go, we need to shift gears and dive into World War Z.
Okay, so we've talked about arming ourselves, fortifying our homes, but World War Z paints a very different picture, doesn't it? It's less about how to survive and more about, well, what happens when society as we know it just crumbles.
Right. World War Z really throws you into the thick of it, doesn't it? It's a global view of a zombie apocalypse told from all these different angles. You've got survivors, politicians, soldiers. Everyone's got a story.
And those stories are terrifying, but also impossible to put down. It's like, even though you know it's fiction, Brooks makes it feel so real.
He's a master storyteller. And he uses that skill to expose these really uncomfortable truths about human nature, like how we respond to a crisis or how easily those in power can dismiss the warning signs of a catastrophe.
You're right. Remember those early warning signs we were talking about? Those get completely ignored in World War Z. Actually, it's worse than that. It's like they're actively covered up, suppressed.
It's almost as if people are willfully blind to the threat, right? They cling to any explanation that allows them to maintain a sense of normalcy.
It's that classic head in the sand approach, even when the world is literally falling apart around them. And Brooks doesn't let us forget that, does he?
Not for a second. He makes you confront that uncomfortable truth about ourselves, that sometimes we'd rather cling to a comforting lie than face an unsettling truth.
Which is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we can't even acknowledge a problem, how can we ever hope to fix it? And Brooks doesn't shy away from showing us just how bad things can get when that denial takes over.
Right, he takes you straight into the heart of the chaos, like with those soldiers fighting on the front lines. The way they describe the battles, it's just horrifying.
Absolutely. Those scenes are incredibly intense, visceral. You could practically feel the panic, the desperation.
And it highlights something that's often overlooked in zombie fiction, the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that you can't reason with, an enemy that doesn't even register fear or pain.
It's like all the rules of warfare go out the window.
Right.
You can't negotiate with a zombie. You can't appeal to its sense of self-preservation.
Exactly. And Brooks really captures that sense of disorientation, that feeling of being lost in a fog of war.
Fog of war. You're really bringing in the military terminology.
Well, it fits, doesn't it? This idea that in any conflict, there's this cloud of confusion, misinformation, uncertainty. You're making decisions with limited information, never quite sure if you're doing the right thing. And in the middle of all that, well, terrible mistakes are made.
And Brooks shows us those mistakes, doesn't he? I mean, even with the best intentions, things go horribly wrong.
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples is the Battle of Yonkers. The military, trying to reclaim New York City, launches this massive counteroffensive. On paper, it should have worked. But what happens?
Total chaos. That's what Brooks shows us. Soldiers panicking, friendly fire incidents, the fog of war descends, and suddenly the lines between good and bad, right and wrong, it all gets blurry.
It's a stark reminder that even with the best training, the best equipment, even with the best of intentions, sometimes it's not enough.
It's scary to think about, isn't it? That fog of war thing. How easily things spiral out of control, even when there's a plan, a strategy. It makes you wonder, what if there was another way to tackle something like this? Something besides just throwing military might at it.
Well, Brooks definitely plants those seeds of doubt. He has that one character, the Chinese virologist, who raises some really interesting questions about the whole military approach.
What does she say again?
Well, she basically says, what if instead of treating the zombie outbreak like a war, we treated it as a public health crisis?
So less about guns and bombs and more about containment and, like, finding a cure.
Exactly. Imagine if all that effort, all those resources, had been directed towards research and medical solutions from the get-go. Would it have made a difference? Could we have actually stopped it?
That's a question I keep asking myself every time I read World War Z. What if we'd tried a different approach? It's like Brooks is urging us to look beyond the immediate crisis and think about the long game.
Absolutely. And that's where the Zombie Survival Guide, as out there as it is, offers some surprisingly practical advice. Learning basic survival skills, being resourceful, knowing how to defend yourself, those are all things that apply to any kind of crisis, right?
Right. So even though we're talking about zombies, the underlying message is about being prepared for the unexpected, whatever that might be.
Exactly. And both books, in their own way, remind us that even when things fall apart, there's still that human element, that capacity for both incredible resilience and, well, sometimes not so great decisions.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That no matter what we face, whether it's a zombie apocalypse or something completely different, it's how we react, how we connect with each other that ultimately determines our survival. So to wrap up this wild ride, here's the takeaway. Be prepared, stay informed, and never, ever underestimate the importance of human connection. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that help us face the unknown and hopefully come out stronger on the other side.